At 72, Dr. Dawn Wilson had spent a lifetime breaking barriers. After decades as a renowned botanist, retirement should have been peaceful. But when she applies to join the prestigious Oakridge Garden Committee, she encounters a shocking rejection based not on her qualifications, but on who she is. What begins as one woman's stand against discrimination unravels decades of corruption and inequity in a small town where power has remained in the same hands for generations. As Dawn gathers evidence and builds allies, she faces escalating threats and intimidation. Her reputation, career, and even her safety are put at risk. But this botanist knows that the most resilient plants are those that withstand the harshest conditions. From public confrontations to courtroom revelations, Dawn's quest for justice transforms not just the garden committee, but the entire community of Oakridge, proving that even at 72, it's never too late to plant the seeds of change. Have you ever witnessed discrimination in your own community? How did you respond? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and justice every week. Dr. Dawn Wilson stood in her garden, carefully pruning the rare orchids she had cultivated for decades. At 72, her hands moved with the precision and confidence that came from a lifetime of botanical research. The morning sunlight filtered through the leaves of her prized specimens, creating dappled patterns on the weathered wooden table where she worked. Her garden was her sanctuary, a living testament to her distinguished career as one of the country's leading botanists. Dawn wiped her brow and smiled at the sound of birds chirping in the old oak tree that shaded her backyard. Retirement had given her the gift of time to tend to her garden, to read the scholarly journals she had once been too busy to enjoy, and to share her knowledge with the younger generation of botanists who often sought her guidance. Today was important. After months of encouragement from her daughter Amara, Dawn had finally submitted an application to the Oakridge Community Garden Committee. The prestigious committee oversaw the town's century-old botanical gardens and selected a handful of local gardeners each year to contribute their expertise and specimens to the annual Garden Festival, an event that attracted visitors from across the state. Dawn checked her watch. The interview was in an hour. She carefully placed her tools in their leather case, a gift from her late husband Marcus on their 30th anniversary. "You'd be proud of me, Marcus," she whispered. "I'm finally putting myself out there again." His passing 3 years ago had nearly broken her, but gardening had saved her, giving her purpose when grief threatened to consume her. Inside her modest but elegant home, Dawn changed into a crisp white blouse and tailored navy pants. She pinned her silver locks into a neat bun and added the pearl earrings Marcus had given her on their first anniversary. Her reflection showed a woman of dignity and accomplishment, her dark skin glowing with health despite her years. As she drove to the Oakridge Community Center, Dawn rehearsed her presentation in her mind. Her proposal focused on introducing rare African plant species to the community garden, plants that could thrive in the local climate while educating visitors about botanical diversity. Her research on these adaptive species had been her life's work, culminating in 3 published books and numerous academic articles. The Oakridge Community Center was housed in a Victorian building with manicured lawns and perfectly arranged flowerbeds. Dawn parked her car and gathered her portfolio, which contained photographs of her award-winning garden, her cultivation techniques, and her proposal for the community garden. Inside, she was directed to a conference room where the garden committee was already seated. 5 people sat around a large oak table, their expressions varying from polite interest to outright boredom. At the head of the table sat Richard Whitman, the committee chairman. His reputation preceded him, a wealthy businessman who had taken over the committee 5 years ago and transformed it into an exclusive club that seemed to favor certain members of the community over others. "Dr. Wilson, I presume," Richard said, not bothering to stand or offer his hand. He was in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that barely looked up from the papers in front of him. "Yes, thank you for seeing me today," Dawn replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the chilly reception. She took the empty seat at the far end of the table. "Your application was interesting," Richard began, his tone suggesting otherwise. "However, I must say we typically select gardeners with more traditional expertise for our committee." Dawn tilted her head slightly. "Traditional expertise? Yes, European gardening traditions. Classic English gardens, French landscape design. Your focus on African plants is rather niche, wouldn't you say?" There was something in his tone that made Dawn's skin prickle. "Actually," Dawn said calmly, "botanical diversity is increasingly recognized as essential for sustainable gardening practices." My research demonstrates how these species can thrive in our climate while requiring less water and fewer pesticides than many European varieties. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Very progressive, but our community appreciates continuity and tradition. Our patrons expect a certain aesthetic. A younger woman at the table, whom Dawn recognized as Lisa Chen, the local librarian, looked uncomfortable. Dr. Wilson's credentials are impressive, she ventured. Her book on adaptive botanicals is actually in our library's special collection. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Yes, the academic achievements are noted, but this is about gardening, not academia. We need practical experience. Dawn took a deep breath. I've been cultivating gardens for over 40 years, Mr. Whitman. My practical experience includes establishing botanical gardens in 3 countries and consulting for the National Arboretum. Perhaps you'd like to see photographs of my current garden? She opened her portfolio and began to pass around stunning images of her meticulously maintained garden. As the photographs made their way around the table, Dawn noticed the committee members' expressions changing, all except Richard's. His frown deepened as he barely glanced at the images. Very nice hobby garden, he said dismissively. But we're looking for expertise in maintaining historical gardens. Your urban gardening approach isn't what we need. Dawn felt her chest tight. My garden isn't urban, Mr. Whitman. As you can see from the photographs, it's on a half-acre property, and I've restored historical gardens at the Harmon Estate and the Westfield Botanical Conservatory. Richard shuffled his papers. Let's move on. Your proposal suggests replacing some of our traditional roses with what you call drought-resistant African species. I'm afraid that's simply not in keeping with our garden's character. I'm not suggesting replacing anything, Dawn clarified. My proposal clearly states adding a new section to showcase botanical diversity while maintaining the existing historical sections. Richard looked directly at her for the first time. Dr. Wilson, let me be frank. The Oakridge Garden Committee has a certain standard and tradition. We serve a community that appreciates classical approaches. Your ideas are simply too exotic for our members' tastes. The way he emphasized exotic made Dawn's stomach turn. She had encountered this kind of veiled language throughout her career. But at 72, she had hoped things would have changed. Classical approaches evolve, Mr. Whitman, Dawn responded evenly. That's the nature of science and art. Not here they don't, Richard replied sharply. Look, I'll be blunt, your ideas don't fit our community's profile. Perhaps the community garden in Westside would be more appropriate for your expertise. Westside was the predominantly black neighborhood across town with significantly fewer resources than Oakridge. The room fell silent. Lisa Chen looked down at her notes, her discomfort evident. The other committee members avoided eye contact. Dawn sat perfectly still, her back straight, her expression composed despite the anger and hurt churning inside her. She had faced discrimination before, but the blatant nature of Richard's dismissal was stunning. I see, Dawn said after a moment, her voice steady. Thank you for your time. She began gathering her materials with deliberate care. As she placed her portfolio back into her leather bag, she noticed Lisa Chen making notes on a small pad. The young woman looked up briefly and gave Dawn an almost imperceptible nod. Dawn stood, her dignity intact. For the record, Mr. Whitman, I've lived in Oakridge for 43 years. This is my community too. She turned to leave but paused at the door. And my garden has been featured in Garden and Home magazine twice. I believe your committee subscribes to that publication. She left without waiting for a response, her head held high. But as she walked to her car, the familiar weight of discrimination settled on her shoulders. She had spent a lifetime breaking barriers in academia and professional circles, only to face the same prejudice in her retirement years from a small-town garden committee. As she drove home, Dawn's mind raced. She had hoped to contribute to the community, to share her knowledge and passion. Instead, she had been dismissed and directed to stay in her place. The injustice of it burned. When she arrived home, Dawn went straight to her garden. Among her plants, she felt her breathing slow and her thoughts clear. As she tended to her prized African violets, a gift from a colleague in Tanzania, Dawn made a decision. This wasn't just about a garden committee position anymore. It was about standing up against the casual discrimination that persisted in her community. She picked up her phone and called her daughter. Amara, it's Mom. Remember that lawyer friend of yours, the one who specializes in discrimination cases? I think I'd like to have a conversation with her. As the sun set over her garden, casting long shadows across the vibrant blooms she had nurtured for decades, Dawn felt a renewed sense of purpose. Richard Whitman and his committee had no idea who they were dealing with. She hadn't spent a lifetime breaking barriers to be silenced now. In the days following the committee meeting, Dawn found herself alternating between indignation and doubt. Had she misinterpreted Richard Whitman's comments? Was she being oversensitive after decades of navigating subtle prejudices in academia? But each time she recalled his dismissive tone and the way he'd suggested she take her expertise to Westside, her resolve strengthened. Dawn sat at her kitchen table, meticulously documenting everything she could remember from the meeting. Every word, every glance, every subtle dismissal. She wrote it all down in her neat, precise handwriting, a habit formed during years of field research when accuracy could mean the difference between identifying a new species or missing a scientific breakthrough. "Mom, you don't have to handle this alone," Amara said, pouring them both tea. At 43, Amara had inherited Dawn's determination and analytical mind, channeling those traits into a successful career as a hospital administrator. "I know, dear," Dawn replied, rubbing her temples. "But I need to be certain. Committee rejections happen all the time for legitimate reasons." "Not like this," Amara insisted, "and not to someone with your credentials." She placed a gentle hand on her mother's shoulder. "Jade can help. She's handled discrimination cases before." Dawn nodded, thinking of Amara's law school friend. "I've scheduled a call with her tomorrow, but first I want to do some research on this committee's history." Later that afternoon, Dawn visited the Oakridge Public Library. The building was quiet, with only a few patrons browsing the shelves. Dawn made her way to the local history section where town records and newspaper archives were kept. "Dr. Wilson," a voice called softly. Dawn turned to see Lisa Chen, the committee member who had acknowledged her credentials during the meeting. "Ms. Chen," Dawn said, surprised. "Hello." Lisa glanced around nervously before approaching. "I wanted to apologize for what happened at the meeting. It was unprofessional and unfair." "Thank you," Dawn replied, "but you weren't responsible for Mr. Whitman's behavior." "No, but I didn't speak up enough either." Lisa hesitated. "I've only been on the committee for 6 months. Mr. Whitman personally selected me and I was honored at first, but now," she trailed off. Dawn studied the younger woman. "Has this happened before?" Lisa's silence was answer enough. Finally, she said, "You're not the first qualified applicant to be rejected for questionable reasons. There was a Hispanic landscape architect last year with amazing credentials, and a young Native American man who specialized in indigenous plants." Dawn felt a chill. "I see. I took notes," Lisa confided, lowering her voice further. "I've been documenting these incidents, I just wasn't sure what to do with them." Dawn considered this information carefully. "Would you be willing to share those notes with me?" Lisa hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I can email them to you, and," she paused, "there's something else you should see." She led Dawn to a computer terminal and pulled up the town's public records database. The committee maintains a photo gallery of all past and present members. Dawn scrolled through decades of committee photographs. The pattern was unmistakable. In 60 years, there had never been a person of color on the Oakridge Garden Committee. "This can't be coincidence," Dawn murmured. "No," Lisa agreed. "And the committee controls significant funding from the town for cultural events. The annual garden festival budget alone is over $100,000. Dawn's botanical research had taught her that patterns in nature were rarely random. The same principle applied here. That evening, Dawn called her neighbor Walter Johnson, who had lived in Oakridge even longer than she had. At 78, Walter had served on several town committees and knew the local political landscape intimately. "Can't say I'm surprised," Walter said after Dawn recounted her experience. "That garden committee's been an old boys' club for as long as I can remember. When Richard took over, he just made it more blatant." "Has anyone ever challenged them?" Dawn asked. "A few have tried," Walter said. "Most give up when they realize how connected Richard is. His family's been in Oakridge for generations. His father was mayor back in the 70s. Dawn thought about this. "The garden committee doesn't just plan flower shows, does it?" Walter chuckled. "Hardly. They control which parts of town get beautification projects. They decide which neighborhoods get the fancy landscaping that boosts property values, and they have the ear of the town council on environmental initiatives. So it's about power and money," Dawn concluded. "Isn't it always?" Walter sighed. "But if anyone can take them on, it's you, Dawn. You've got the reputation and the respect of this community, the real community, not just Richard's circle." The next day, Dawn spoke with Jade Williams, Amara's friend and a civil rights attorney. Over video chat, Dawn shared what she had learned. "This is concerning," Jade said, her professional demeanor not masking her indignation. "If what you're describing is accurate, this could constitute a pattern of discriminatory practices." "What would I need to prove that?" Dawn asked. "Documentation is key," Jade explained. "Witness statements, records of rejected applicants, evidence of disparate treatment. The more you can gather, the stronger the case." Dawn thought of Lisa's notes. I may have a start on that. Good, Jade nodded. The next step would be to file a formal complaint with the town's Human Rights Commission. That creates an official record and requires an investigation. And if that doesn't work, Dawn asked. Then we consider legal action, Jade said firmly. But let's start with the formal channels. That afternoon, Dawn visited the Oakridge Community Center again, this time to submit a formal complaint to the town clerk. As she filled out the paperwork, she noticed Richard Whitman in an adjacent office, deep in conversation with a woman Dawn recognized as Barbara Thornton, the town council president. When Richard spotted Dawn, he abruptly ended his conversation and approached her. Dr. Wilson, he said, his voice artificially pleasant. Reconsidering your application, perhaps we could find a small plot for your exotic specimens. Dawn met his gaze steadily. Actually, Mr. Whitman, I'm filing a formal complaint regarding discriminatory practices by the Garden Committee. Richard's affable mask slipped. That's absurd. We simply determined your proposal wasn't a good fit. A pattern of determining that qualified candidates of color aren't a good fit constitutes discrimination, Mr. Whitman, Dawn replied calmly, aware that others in the office had stopped to listen. Richard's face reddened. You're making a serious accusation based on one rejection. That's hardly evidence of a pattern. I have more evidence than you might think, Dawn said. She handed her completed form to the clerk, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. Dr. Wilson, I'd advise you to reconsider this course of action. Oakridge is a small town. These kinds of accusations can damage reputations, yours included. Dawn refused to be intimidated. I've spent my career documenting and classifying things accurately, Mr. Whitman. This is no different. As she turned to leave, Richard called after her. Your precious African plants wouldn't have survived our winter anyway. Some things just don't belong where they're not naturally suited. Dawn paused, turning back to him with a serene smile. Actually, Mr. Whitman, my research specifically focuses on adaptive species that thrive in diverse environments. It's resistance to change that doesn't survive in nature. With that, she walked out, aware of the quiet murmurs behind her. By the time Dawn returned home, her phone was buzzing with messages. Word had spread quickly in the small town. Some expressed support, others concern. A few suggested she was overreacting. Dawn sat in her garden, drawing strength from the vibrant ecosystem she had created. Among her prized specimens was a resilient African violet that had survived transplanting across continents, adapting to new soil and climate without losing its essential character. Like that violet, Dawn had spent a lifetime adapting to environments not always welcoming, finding ways to thrive despite resistance. She picked up her phone and called Walter. I need your help, she said. We need to find others who have been rejected by the committee. I've already started making calls, Walter replied. And you should know Lisa Chen just reached out to me. She's willing to go on record about what she's witnessed. Dawn felt a surge of determination. Richard Whitman had underestimated her, assuming that at 72 she wouldn't have the energy or will to challenge him. But a lifetime of breaking barriers had prepared her for precisely this moment. As evening fell, Dawn walked through her garden, touching the leaves of plants she had nurtured for decades. Each one had faced challenges, drought, frost, pests, and survived through adaptation and resilience. She would do the same. Her phone rang. It was Amara. Mom, are you okay? I heard what happened. I'm more than okay, Dawn replied, her voice steady with resolve. I'm just getting started. The following week brought surprising developments as Dawn's complaint rippled through Oakridge. What had begun as a personal grievance was evolving into something larger, revealing fractures in the community that had long been papered over with politeness and tradition. Dawn sat in the sunny breakfast nook of her home, surrounded by newspaper clippings, notes, and a growing list of names. Walter Johnson had been remarkably effective at connecting her with others who had encountered the Garden Committee's exclusionary practices. Dr. Wilson, it's Marcus Torres returning your call, came a deep voice over the speakerphone. Mr. Torres, thank you for speaking with me, Dawn responded, pen poised over her notebook. Please call me Marcus, and I should be thanking you. When Walter told me someone was finally challenging Richard Whitman, I couldn't believe it. Dawn listened intently as Marcus, a landscape architect with degrees from Cornell and UCLA, described his experience applying to the committee the previous year. His proposal for incorporating sustainable, drought-resistant plants native to the Southwest had been dismissed as too regional and not in keeping with the Oakridge aesthetic. Did Mr. Whitman suggest you take your proposal elsewhere? Dawn asked, recalling her own experience. Almost verbatim, Marcus confirmed. He said my ideas might be better received in communities that appreciate that sort of design. The implication was clear. Dawn made careful notes. Marcus was the third person she'd spoken with who described nearly identical treatment. Would you be willing to provide a written statement about your experience? Dawn asked. Absolutely, Marcus replied without hesitation. And I'll do you one better, I still have the rejection letter they sent. It's full of coded language about traditional standards and maintaining the character of Oakridge Gardens. Dawn felt a surge of hope. Documented evidence would strengthen their case considerably. After the call, Dawn checked her email to find a message from Lisa Chen with a subject line that simply read, "You need to see this." Attached were internal committee meeting minutes from the past 3 years, meticulously documenting discussions about applicants, budget allocations, and project approvals. Dawn scanned the documents, her academic training allowing her to quickly identify patterns. Proposals from applicants of color were consistently subjected to additional character evaluations not applied to white applicants. Beautification projects were overwhelmingly approved for neighborhoods with predominantly white residents. Even the selection of plants revealed a bias, rejecting species with African, Asian, or South American origins as unsuitable despite scientific evidence to the contrary. The doorbell rang, interrupting Dawn's analysis. She opened the front door to find a slim, elegant woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Dr. Wilson, I'm Jade Williams. We spoke on the phone. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but I was in the area for another case." Dawn welcomed Amara's friend inside, oddly relieved to have legal expertise physically present rather than just over the phone. "You've been busy," Jade remarked, surveying the organized chaos of Dawn's evidence gathering. "A botanist's work is all about classification and documentation," Dawn replied with a small smile. "These skills transfer surprisingly well to building a discrimination case." Over tea, Dawn shared her findings with Jade, who listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or suggesting additional avenues to explore. "This is compelling," Jade said finally, reviewing Lisa's committee minutes. "Especially combined with the testimonials you've gathered, the pattern is clear." "Is it enough?" Dawn asked. Jade considered. "It's a strong start, but we need to understand the full scope of the harm. This isn't just about garden aesthetics, it's about resource allocation, property values, and access to public spaces." Dawn nodded. "Walter mentioned the committee controls significant funding." "Exactly, we need to follow the money," Jade confirmed. "The beautification projects they approve directly impact property values. By systematically excluding certain neighborhoods, they're perpetuating economic disparities." A knock at the door interrupted them. Dawn opened it to find Lisa Chen looking nervous but determined. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," Lisa said quickly, "but something's happening. Richard called an emergency committee meeting for tomorrow. He's proposing a restructuring of the application process and committee bylaws." Jade frowned. "He's trying to cover his tracks." "Can he do that?" Dawn asked. "He can try," Lisa replied. "But as committee secretary, I'm required to document the changes and maintain records of the previous procedures. And," she hesitated, "I'm not the only committee member who's uncomfortable with Richard's leadership." Dawn invited Lisa in, introducing her to Jade. As they talked, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Sarah Abernathy, the committee's treasurer and a retired accountant, had been quietly questioning Richard's budget allocations for years. "Sarah believes Richard has been directing funds toward projects that benefit his friends' properties," Lisa explained. "She's kept detailed records but feared retribution if she spoke up alone." Jade leaned forward. "Would she be willing to share those records?" Lisa nodded. "That's partly why I'm here. She asked me to give you this." Lisa handed Dawn a USB drive. "It contains budget reports for the past 5 years, with Sarah's annotations about discrepancies." Dawn felt a growing sense that this case was about much more than her rejected application. It was about a system that had been allowed to perpetuate inequality under the guise of tradition and aesthetic standards. The next day brought unexpected support. Dawn's phone rang continuously with calls from community members who had heard about her complaint. Many had stories of their own about Richard Whitman's influence in town matters, extending far beyond the Garden Committee. "The whole system's rigged," declared Mabel Washington, an 80-year-old resident of Westside who had lived in Oakridge her entire life. "Those flowers they plant downtown, never seen a single petal in Westside, but our property taxes pay for it just the same." By afternoon, Dawn's living room had become an impromptu meeting place. Walter Johnson arrived with historical records showing how the town's resources had been distributed over decades. Sarah Abernathy, having decided to take a stand, brought additional financial documents and introduced Dawn to two other committee members who shared her concerns. "We've been afraid to challenge Richard," admitted George Peterson, who had served on the committee for 5 years. "His family's connections run deep in this town, which is precisely why someone needed to stand up to him," Dawn replied firmly. As Jade reviewed the growing evidence, she looked up at Dawn with new respect. "Dr. Wilson, you've built a remarkable coalition in just a week. This case has evolved from individual discrimination to a pattern of systematic exclusion with financial implications." Dawn considered this. "So what's our next step?" "Two tracks," Jade advised. "First, we continue with your original complaint, which now has substantial supporting evidence. Second, we request a formal audit of the committee's financial decisions through the town council." "Richard has allies on the council," Sarah warned. "But not all of them," Walter countered. "Barbara Thornton's term as council president ends next month. Her successor, James Lee, has been vocal about transparency in town governance." Dawn processed this information, strategizing like she would approach a complex research problem. "We need to make this public," she decided. "Not just the discrimination aspect, but the financial mismanagement." "The annual town meeting is next week," George noted. "Every resident can speak for 3 minutes. It's broadcast on local access TV." "Perfect timing," Jade smiled. "But expect pushback. Richard won't surrender his position without a fight." As if on cue, Dawn's phone rang. The caller ID showed the Oakridge Chronicle, the local newspaper. "Dr. Wilson, this is Rebecca Sanderson from the Chronicle. We've heard about your complaint against the Garden Committee. Mr. Whitman has provided a statement calling your accusations the bitter reactions of a rejected applicant with an axe to grind. Would you care to comment?" Dawn took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I would be happy to share the documented evidence of systematic discrimination and questionable financial practices that extend far beyond my personal experience." Perhaps the Chronicle would be interested in reviewing the pattern of exclusion that has characterized the committee's decisions for decades. There was a moment of silence before Rebecca spoke again, her tone noticeably more engaged. "That sounds like a much bigger story than what Mr. Whitman described. Would you be willing to meet for an interview?" "Absolutely," Dawn replied. "And I won't be alone." After arranging the interview for the following day, Dawn turned back to the group gathered in her living room. The faces looking back at her reflected determination, hope, and in some cases long-suppressed anger at injustices tolerated for too long. "This isn't just about gardens anymore," Dawn acknowledged. "This is about who has a voice in shaping our community." As evening approached, Dawn walked her visitors to the door. The last to leave was Mabel Washington, who took Dawn's hands in her own weathered ones. "I remember when you moved to Oakridge," Mabel said softly. "First black woman professor at the college. Folks said you wouldn't last a year, but you put down roots here just like those plants of yours." She squeezed Dawn's hands. "Some people spend their whole lives making noise without making a difference. You've been quiet for decades, but when you finally speak up, you're moving mountains." After everyone had gone, Dawn returned to her garden in the fading light. Among her prized specimens was a baobab sapling, painstakingly cultivated from seeds she had brought back from a research trip to Madagascar 20 years ago. Experts had told her it wouldn't survive in Oakridge's climate, yet here it stood, adapting and growing. Untouched its leaves gently. "We're both stubborn survivors, aren't we?" she murmured. The sapling, like Dawn herself, had defied expectations by finding ways to thrive in supposedly inhospitable conditions. As darkness fell, Dawn's phone chimed with a text from Amara. "Just heard from Jade. So proud of you, Mom. Dad would be too." Dawn smiled, feeling Marcus's presence as strongly as if he were still beside her. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Richard would undoubtedly escalate his counterattack. But tonight, surrounded by the garden she had built against all odds, Dawn felt ready. This fight wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, whose talents had been dismissed, whose contributions had been devalued. In the quiet darkness of her garden, Dawn made a promise to herself. Justice would take root in Oakridge, and like her beloved plants, it would flourish. The morning brought cloudy skies and a forecast of rain, fitting weather for the storm brewing in Oakridge. Dawn sat at her kitchen table, reviewing her notes for the newspaper interview while the radio played softly in the background. She paused when the local news segment began, nearly dropping her teacup at what she heard. In local news, longtime Oakridge Garden Committee Chairman Richard Whitman has issued a statement regarding recent allegations of discriminatory practices. Whitman categorically denies the claims, calling them baseless attacks on a cherished community institution. The statement goes on to assert that the committee's selection process is merit-based and points to Dr. Dawn Wilson's lack of experience with traditional gardening practices as the sole reason for her rejection. Dawn shook her head, unsurprised but still disappointed by Richard's public response. She turned off the radio just as her doorbell rang. Rebecca Sanderson from the Oakridge Chronicle stood on her porch, recorder in hand, her expression professionally neutral. Behind her was a photographer who gave Dawn a polite nod. "Dr. Wilson, thank you for agreeing to this interview," Rebecca began once they were settled in Dawn's living room. "Mr. Whitman's statement this morning was quite definitive. How do you respond to his characterization of your allegations?" Dawn smiled calmly. "Ms. Sanderson, I've spent my career as a scientist where claims require evidence. I wouldn't have filed a formal complaint without substantial documentation." She gestured to the organized files on her coffee table. "Would you like to see what merit-based rejection looks like in practice?" For the next hour, Dawn methodically presented her evidence, the pattern of rejections, the committee minutes, the financial irregularities, and testimonials from others who had experienced similar treatment. Rebecca's professional detachment gradually gave way to genuine interest as she realized the story was far more significant than a personal grievance. "This is extensive," Rebecca admitted, reviewing the documents. "May I make copies of some of these records?" "Of course," Dawn agreed. "Transparency is precisely what we're seeking." As the interview concluded, Rebecca asked a final question. "Dr. Wilson, why pursue this now? You've had a distinguished career, you're respected in your field. Why not simply enjoy your retirement?" Dawn considered the question carefully. "Ms. Sanderson, have you ever watched a garden over time?" The reporter looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I follow. A garden isn't static, it's always changing. Plants compete for resources, some thrive while others struggle. Without proper tending, the strongest can choke out the rest, leaving only a monoculture." Dawn's voice took on the measured cadence she had used when lecturing. "What appears orderly on the surface can mask deep inequities. I've spent my life studying how diversity strengthens ecosystems. The same principle applies to communities." Rebecca nodded slowly. "And you believe Oakridge has been functioning as a monoculture, one that's carefully cultivated and maintained by a few?" "Yes." Dawn met her gaze steadily. "And like any unbalanced ecosystem, it's ultimately unsustainable." After Rebecca and the photographer left, Dawn barely had time to gather her thoughts before her phone rang. It was Lisa Chen, her voice tight with tension. "Dr. Wilson, there's been a development. Richard called me into his office this morning. He knows I've been sharing information with you." Dawn felt a chill. "How did he find out?" "I'm not sure, but he had printed copies of emails I sent you." Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper. "He threatened my job at the library, said he'd make sure the Board of Trustees heard about my breach of confidentiality." "He can't do that," Dawn insisted, though she knew full well that Richard's influence extended throughout the town. "He also," Lisa hesitated. "He also implied that he has friends at the university where you worked. Said it would be a shame if questions arose about your research grants." Dawn felt a flash of anger. "That's a direct threat." "There's more," Lisa continued. "Sarah was called in after me. She texted that Richard's launching an internal audit to identify the source of misinformation about committee finances." Dawn's mind raced. Richard was moving quickly to discredit his critics and cover his tracks. "Lisa, document everything he said to you, word for word, as best you can remember. And tell Sarah to do the same." After hanging up, Dawn immediately called Jade to relay these developments. "He's escalating," Jade confirmed. "We expected this, but not so quickly. The threats against your professional reputation and Lisa's job are serious." "What can we do?" Dawn asked. "Document and publicize," Jade advised. "The more his threats are exposed, the less power they have, and we need to move up our timeline for the financial audit request." Throughout the day, Dawn's phone buzzed constantly with messages from unexpected allies. The Chronicle interview had sparked conversations across town. Walter reported that his phone was ringing off the hook, with people wanting to share their experiences with the Garden Committee. By evening, Richard's counteroffensive was in full swing. The local radio station aired an interview where he portrayed himself as the defender of Oakridge traditions against outside influences seeking to politicize gardening. He emphasized his family's long history in the town and subtly questioned Dawn's commitment to community values. 43 years in Oakridge, and he still considers me an outsider," Dawn remarked to Amara during their nightly call. "Because you challenge the status quo, Mom," Amara replied. "That makes you perpetually outside to people like Richard." The next morning brought gray skies and steady rain. Dawn was preparing to leave for a meeting with Jade when she noticed a car parked across the street, one that had been there for hours. As she watched through her window, a man with a camera with a telephoto lens raised it toward her house. Dawn felt a surge of indignation. Richard was having her surveilled, looking for anything that might discredit her. She considered confronting the photographer but decided against it. There were more strategic battles to fight. At Jade's office, Dawn found Sarah Abernathy already present, looking nervous but determined. Richard's scrambling to cover the financial trails, Sarah explained, spreading spreadsheets across Jade's desk. He's called an emergency budget meeting for tomorrow to reallocate funds and update our record-keeping processes. Jade examined the documents. This is blatant. He's trying to obscure the paper trail before any official investigation. Can he do that? Dawn asked. Not legally, Jade replied. But if nobody stops him, he can create enough confusion to make proving malfeasance much harder. Sarah looked down at her hands. There's something else you should know. My husband's contracting business has suddenly lost 3 major clients, all friends of Richard. They've cited budget constraints, but the timing. Jade's expression hardened. Economic retribution, this crosses yet another line. Dawn felt a weight of responsibility. People were suffering real consequences for supporting her. Maybe we should. Don't even think about backing down, Sarah interrupted firmly. Richard's shown his true colors. If we stop now, he wins and nothing changes. Jade nodded in agreement. Besides, these tactics only strengthen our case. Each threat, each act of retaliation builds evidence of abuse of power. That afternoon, Dawn returned home to find a large envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a thick stack of papers, photocopies of committee records dating back 20 years, with handwritten notes in the margins tracking rejected applicants of color and the systematic diversion of beautification funds away from certain neighborhoods. A sticky note on the front simply read, "Not everyone in this town supports Richard. Use this wisely. A friend." Dawn carefully reviewed the documents, which provided a damning historical perspective on the committee's practices. The pattern wasn't new. Richard had simply continued and expanded discriminatory practices that predated his chairmanship. As she organized this new evidence, Dawn's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Rebecca Sanderson again, looking somewhat apologetic. "Dr. Wilson, I'm sorry to disturb you again, but something's come up." Rebecca handed Dawn the next day's edition of the Chronicle, fresh from the printer. "My editor wanted me to give you a heads up about what's running tomorrow." Dawn scanned the front page, her heart sinking. The headline read, "Garden Committee Chair DEFENDS Tradition Amid Controversy." The article quoted Richard extensively, portraying the situation as a disagreement about gardening philosophy rather than discrimination and financial impropriety. "This isn't the story I wrote," Rebecca said quietly. "My editor made significant changes. Richard and the publisher play golf together." Dawn handed the paper back, her expression resigned but not surprised. Another example of how influence works in this town. "I'm not supposed to tell you this," Rebecca continued, lowering her voice, "but there was an anonymous letter sent to the Chronicle yesterday with financial records showing irregularities in Garden Committee spending. My editor refused to run it, claiming it needed verification. While running Richard's unverified claims without question," Dawn noted dryly. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. "I wanted you to know that not everyone at the paper agrees with how this is being handled. Some of us believe this story deserves proper investigation." After Rebecca left, Dawn sat in her garden despite the rain, letting the gentle drops mingle with tears of frustration. The challenges were mounting, Richard's reach proving even more extensive than she had anticipated. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was this fight worth the cost to herself and others? A movement caught her eye, a hummingbird visiting her rare cardinal flowers undeterred by the rain. Dawn had cultivated those flowers from seeds, nurturing them through seasons when conventional wisdom said they wouldn't survive. Yet here they were, providing sustenance for the tiny bird braving the storm. Dawn's phone rang. It was Walter. "Turn on Channel 7, he said without preamble. "Now." Dawn hurried inside and switched on her television to find James Lee, the incoming town council president, giving a press conference. "In light of recent allegations regarding the Oakridge Garden Committee's practices, I am announcing the formation of an independent review panel to investigate claims of discrimination and financial irregularities," Lee stated firmly. "This panel will have full access to committee records and the authority to interview all relevant parties. The integrity of our town institutions must be beyond reproach." Dawn sank into her chair, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. James Lee had just changed the game entirely. With an official investigation launched by the incoming council president, Richard's ability to control the narrative was suddenly limited. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jade. Lee just raised the stakes. Richard will be desperate now, be careful. As if to confirm Jade's warning, Dawn's phone rang again. The caller ID showed unknown, but Dawn answered anyway. Dr. Wilson, Richard's voice was coldly controlled. I thought we should speak directly. This situation has gotten out of hand. I agree, Dawn replied calmly. Threats against people's livelihoods and reputations are indeed out of hand. There was a pause before Richard continued. You've made your point. Perhaps we could reach an accommodation. The committee could reconsider your application, create a special showcase for your unique plants. In return, you withdraw your complaint and these baseless accusations about financial impropriety. Dawn almost laughed at the transparency of the offer. Mr. Whitman, this stopped being about my garden weeks ago. This is about a system that has excluded qualified people based on race for decades while diverting public resources to benefit a select few. You're making enemies you don't need, Dawn, Richard's voice hardened. Oakridge is a small town with a long memory. Yes, it is, Dawn agreed. Which is why it's time for a full accounting of how it's been run. Good evening, Mr. Whitman. She ended the call and sat in the growing darkness of her living room, listening to the rain against the windows. The forces aligned against her were powerful, with deep roots in the community. But something was shifting in Oakridge, a long-dormant seed of justice beginning to germinate. Dawn thought of her baobab sapling, how it had seemed to struggle at first, its growth imperceptible for months, until suddenly it put forth new leaves with unexpected vigor. Change could appear stalled until reaching some hidden tipping point, then emerge with surprising strength. She picked up her phone and began making calls. If Richard wanted war, she would give him one fought not with threats and intimidation, but with truth, evidence, and the growing coalition of voices that had been silenced for too long. Outside, the rain continued to fall, nourishing the roots of plants that would emerge stronger for having weathered the storm. The Oakridge Community Center hummed with activity as residents filed in for the monthly town council meeting. Though these gatherings typically drew modest attendance, tonight every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. The controversy surrounding the Garden Committee had awakened civic engagement throughout the community. Dawn arrived early, accompanied by Jade, Walter, and Amara, who had taken a day off work to support her mother. They found seats near the front, where Dawn could easily approach the microphone during the public comment period. Look at this turnout, Walter whispered, surveying the room. Haven't seen this many people at a council meeting since they tried to change the zoning on Main Street. Dawn nodded, recognizing faces from across Oakridge, not just her supporters, but curious onlookers and Richard's allies as well. She spotted Richard himself in conversation with Barbara Thornton, the outgoing council president. His expression was confident, almost smug, suggesting he believed he still controlled the situation. James Lee, the incoming president, caught Dawn's eye from the council table and gave her a subtle nod. His announcement of an independent review panel had changed the dynamic, but tonight's meeting would still be crucial for shaping public perception. Are you ready? Amara asked, squeezing her mother's hand. As ready as I'll ever be, Dawn replied. She patted the folder in her lap containing her prepared statement, meticulously crafted with Jade's guidance to be both factual and compelling. At precisely 7 o'clock, Barbara Thornton called the meeting to order, working through routine business with practiced efficiency. Dawn noticed how she rushed through the approval of minutes and budget matters, items that typically received more attention. She's trying to limit discussion of financial decisions, Jade murmured, clearly thinking the same thing. Finally, they reached the public comment period. Barbara announced, each speaker has 3 minutes. Please state your name and address before beginning your remarks. Dawn was the fourth person called to the microphone. She walked forward steadily, feeling dozens of eyes following her movement. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the microphone to her height. My name is Dr. Dawn Wilson. I've lived at 427 Maple Avenue for 43 years. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying to the back of the room without strain. I'm here to address the ongoing issues with the Oakridge Garden Committee. Dawn briefly recounted her experience applying to the committee, careful to focus on factual details rather than emotions. She then broadened her scope. My rejection might seem like a small matter, but it reflects a documented pattern of exclusion that has characterized this committee for decades. Dawn gestured to the folder she held. I have compiled evidence showing that qualified applicants of color have been systematically rejected, while the committee's substantial budget has been disproportionately allocated to projects benefiting certain neighborhoods and private properties with connections to committee leadership. A murmur ran through the crowd. Dawn continued, her academic training evident in her methodical presentation. The independent review announced by Councilman Lee is a positive step, but it must address both the discrimination and the financial irregularities. This isn't about gardens, it's about equity, transparency, and the proper use of public funds that belong to all Oakridge residents. As her allotted time neared its end, Dawn delivered her closing statement. For too long, we've allowed traditions to mask inequities. True community growth requires diversity in our gardens and in our governance. I call on this council to ensure the review is thorough, transparent, and results in meaningful reforms. Thank you. The room erupted in applause from many attendees, while others sat with arms folded, expressions disapproving. Barbara Thornton tapped her gavel for order, calling the next speaker, Richard Whitman. Richard approached the microphone with the confidence of someone who had stood there countless times before. My name is Richard Whitman, 312 Heritage Lane, and I've served this community for over 20 years. His voice carried the practiced timbre of authority. It saddens me to see a respected institution like the Garden Committee subjected to these unfounded accusations. Dr. Wilson's application was rejected on merit alone. Her proposed plants were unsuitable for our climate and inconsistent with the historical character of Oakridge Gardens. Richard shifted his stance, addressing the council directly. As for the financial allegations, they're simply mistaken interpretations of routine budget allocations by people unfamiliar with horticultural costs and committee procedures. I welcome Councilman Lee's review, which I'm confident will vindicate our committee's integrity. He turned slightly, scanning the audience. Oakridge has always valued tradition and continuity. The Garden Committee reflects those values. We shouldn't allow politicized attacks to undermine what generations have built. Dawn maintained a neutral expression throughout Richard's remarks, but she noticed how he never directly addressed the documented pattern of rejections or the specific financial discrepancies Sarah had identified. After Richard, a parade of speakers approached the microphone. Some defended the committee as a cherished institution, while others shared their own experiences of exclusion. Marcus Torres eloquently described his rejection despite his professional credentials. Sarah Abernathy, despite visible nervousness, detailed specific financial irregularities she had documented as treasurer. The most moving testimony came from Mabel Washington, who slowly made her way to the microphone with the aid of a cane. At 80, her voice still carried the strength of conviction. I've lived in Westside my entire life, she began. For 60 years, I've paid taxes that fund beautification projects I never see in my neighborhood. The Garden Committee plants flowers downtown but tells us we need to maintain community character when we ask for the same. What exactly does that mean? Her pointed question hung in the air. Dr. Wilson isn't just fighting for herself. She's fighting for all of us who have been told we don't quite fit the Oakridge aesthetic. As the public comment period concluded, James Lee addressed the council. Given the significant community interest in this matter, I propose we expand the scope of the independent review to include a comprehensive audit of Garden Committee finances for the past 10 years and a thorough examination of the application process, with findings to be made public. Barbara Thornton looked displeased but recognized she was outnumbered as other council members voiced support for Lee's proposal. The motion is approved, she announced curtly. The review will begin next week. After the meeting adjourned, Dawn found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, many sharing their own stories of exclusion from various town institutions. The energy in the room had shifted. What had begun as one woman's complaint had catalyzed a broader conversation about governance in Oakridge. As Dawn and her group prepared to leave, Richard approached, his smile tight and unconvincing. Quite a performance, Dr. Wilson, he said, keeping his voice low. But these theatrical town meetings don't change anything. The review will find some minor procedural issues at most. I'll implement cosmetic changes and everything will continue as before. Jade stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Whitman, the expanded scope of the review transforms this into a much more significant investigation. The financial audit alone. Richard cut her off. Save the legal posturing. This town runs on relationships, not regulations. A week from now, half these people won't even remember why they were upset. Dawn met his gaze calmly. You underestimate this community, Mr. Whitman, and you underestimate the power of truth when it finally emerges. As Richard walked away, Dawn felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Rebecca Sanderson, the Chronicle reporter, accompanied by a serious-looking man in his 60s. "Dr. Wilson, this is Howard Mercer, editor-in-chief of the State Tribune," Rebecca introduced him. "He's interested in your story." Howard extended his hand. "Ms. Sanderson shared some of the documentation you provided. The Tribune covers statewide news, and we believe what's happening in Oakridge may reflect similar patterns in other communities. Would you be willing to speak with me?" Dawn glanced at Rebecca, who explained, "The Chronicle may have limitations in its coverage, but the Tribune operates independently." For the first time, Dawn felt the potential ripple effects of her stand against the Garden Committee. A statewide publication would bring scrutiny beyond Richard's sphere of influence. The following days brought intense activity. The independent review panel, consisting of 3 respected professionals from neighboring towns, began interviewing committee members and reviewing documents. James Lee ensured they had unfettered access to all records, despite Barbara Thornton's attempts to limit the scope of their investigation. Dawn's home continued to serve as an informal headquarters, with Walter coordinating outreach to community members who had experienced discrimination, while Sarah and Lisa provided internal committee documents that revealed concerning patterns. Howard Mercer's Tribune article appeared midweek, presenting a detailed account of the Garden Committee controversy and placing it in the context of similar struggles for equity in small towns across the state. The headline "Small Town, Big Inequities: How Oakridge Gardens Grew Discrimination" brought attention far beyond local borders. The morning after the Tribune article appeared, Dawn received an unexpected visitor. Barbara Thornton stood on her porch looking uncomfortable but determined. "May I come in, Dr. Wilson?" she asked, her usual authoritative tone subdued. Dawn invited her inside, curious about this development. Barbara declined to offer tea, getting straight to the point. "I'm retiring from the council next month, as you know. I've served this town for 20 years and I've always believed I was acting in Oakridge's best interests." Dawn listened without interrupting. "The Tribune article made me realize how things must appear from other perspectives." Barbara chose her words carefully. "Richard and I have been friends for decades. Perhaps that friendship clouded my judgment regarding committee matters." "It's difficult to question long-standing arrangements," Dawn acknowledged, offering the outgoing council president a dignified path. Barbara nodded. "Yes. Well, I wanted you to know that I've recused myself from all matters related to the review. James Lee will oversee the process entirely." She paused. "And I've provided the panel with my complete correspondence regarding committee appointments and budgets." After Barbara left, Dawn called Jade to relay this surprising development. "The rats are leaving the ship," Jade observed. "Barbara's trying to protect her legacy before the review potentially implicates her in Richard's practices." "I think it's more than that," Dawn replied thoughtfully. She seemed genuinely troubled by what she's beginning to see. The next day brought news that the review panel had subpoenaed 10 years of committee financial records and requested documentation from the town's bank regarding project payments. Sarah reported that Richard had been closeted with the committee's lawyer for hours, emerging looking ashen. By week's end, the momentum had shifted dramatically. Richard's attempts to control the narrative through friendly local media had been overwhelmed by the Tribune's coverage and the official investigation. Even his supporters on the committee began to distance themselves, worried about their own reputations. Dawn received a call from James Lee on Friday afternoon. "Dr. Wilson, I wanted to inform you personally. The preliminary findings of the review panel are significant enough that they've referred certain financial matters to the district attorney's office for potential investigation of misappropriation of public funds." Dawn sat down, absorbing the magnitude of this development. What had begun as a challenge to discrimination had uncovered potential criminal activity. "The panel's full report won't be ready for another 2 weeks," Lee continued, "but I felt you should know that your complaint has led to serious consequences." That evening, as Dawn tended her garden in the fading light, she reflected on how quickly events had evolved. Her simple act of resistance had uncovered layers of entrenched inequity and misconduct that might otherwise have remained hidden for years to come. Amara called, as she did every evening. "Mom, have you seen the news? They're saying Richard might resign before the full report is released." "That wouldn't surprise me," Dawn replied. "He's always been protective of his reputation. Resigning would let him control the narrative, claim he's stepping down for the good of the community rather than facing the full findings." "Would that be enough after everything he's done?" Amara asked. Dawn considered the question carefully. This was never about punishing Richard. It was about changing a system that allowed discrimination and favoritism to flourish. If his resignation helps facilitate that change, that's progress. After talking with Amara, Dawn received another call, this time from Lisa Chen. Dr. Wilson, something's happening. Richard called an emergency committee meeting for tomorrow morning. He wouldn't say why, but he's been clearing out his office. The next morning, Dawn sat in her garden, drinking tea and watching birds visit her feeders. Though invited to attend the emergency meeting as an observer, she had declined. This moment belonged to the committee members who had found the courage to stand against long-standing corruption. Her phone rang at precisely 10:30. It was Sarah. "It's done," she said simply. Richard resigned, effective immediately. The committee voted unanimously to implement new application procedures with clear, objective criteria and to establish an ethics review process for all budget allocations. Dawn closed her eyes briefly, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and solemn responsibility. "And the leadership?" she asked. "That's the other news," Sarah replied, her voice brightening. "The committee voted to appoint a 3-person interim leadership council until permanent reforms are implemented. Lisa, George, and I will serve for 6 months while we restructure." "Congratulations," Dawn said warmly. "That's wonderful news." "There's more," Sarah continued. "Our first unanimous vote was to extend an invitation to you to serve as special advisor on botanical diversity and inclusion initiatives." Dawn smiled. "I'd be honored." As she ended the call, Dawn looked out over her garden, the diverse plants from across the world that had learned to thrive together in Oakridge soil. Some had needed special care at first, extra protection from frost or additional drainage, but once established, they had become integral parts of the ecosystem, strengthening the whole garden with their unique contributions. The town, she reflected, could learn much from these plants. Different origins, different needs, but capable of creating something beautiful and resilient when given the opportunity to flourish together. The fight wasn't over. The district attorney's investigation, the full review panel report, and the implementation of lasting reforms still lay ahead. But today marked a significant turning point. A system that had seemed immutable had begun to change, proving that even the most entrenched injustices could be uprooted when confronted with persistence, evidence, and collective action. Dawn picked up her garden shears and resumed pruning her roses. There was still much work to be done, in the garden and in Oakridge. But for the first time in decades, the ground had been properly prepared for new growth. The community center's meeting room buzzed with tension as Dawn took her seat beside Jade. 6 weeks had passed since Richard's resignation, and today the independent review panel would present its complete findings to the town council and the public. The room was even more crowded than the town meeting had been, with residents from every neighborhood in Oakridge present, along with reporters from several regional newspapers. "Nervous?" Jade whispered as they waited for the proceedings to begin. "Curious," Dawn corrected. "We've seen the preliminary findings, but I suspect there's more we don't know yet." The review panel consisted of 3 professionals: Regina Martinez, a retired judge, Daniel Kim, a forensic accountant, and Patricia Ackafer, an urban planning expert. They sat at a table facing the audience, their expressions serious as they arranged their materials. James Lee, now officially installed as town council president, called the meeting to order. "Today we receive the complete findings of the independent review panel regarding the practices of the Oakridge Garden Committee. Their investigation has been thorough and independent. The town council has not seen this report in advance and will be hearing these findings alongside all of you." He nodded to Judge Martinez, who rose to address the gathering. "Thank you, President Lee. Over the past 6 weeks, our panel has conducted an exhaustive review of garden committee practices, including membership selection, budget allocations, project approvals, and financial transactions dating back 15 years. She paused, surveying the attentive audience. "What we found was disturbing. The pattern of discrimination in committee appointments was not incidental but systematic and intentional." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Martinez continued, outlining how the committee had used coded language and subjective criteria to justify rejecting qualified applicants of color. Phrases like "not aligned with community aesthetic" and "insufficient understanding of traditional practices" appeared repeatedly in rejection letters to non-white applicants, while white applicants with similar or lesser qualifications were consistently approved. "We discovered an internal scoring system," Martinez revealed, displaying a document on the large screen behind her. Candidates received additional community integration points for family connections to Oakridge, membership in certain social organizations, and residents in specific neighborhoods, all factors that disproportionately favored white applicants. Dawn felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The evidence confirmed what she had experienced, but seeing the calculated nature of the discrimination laid bare was still painful. Daniel Kim took over to present the financial findings. The committee controlled an annual budget averaging $187,000, significantly more than most residents realized, he began. These funds came from town taxes, state grants, and private donations. Kim methodically outlined how beautification projects had been concentrated in 3 neighborhoods over 15 years, all areas with high property values and residents connected to committee leadership. Meanwhile, Westside and other diverse neighborhoods had received less than 7% of project funding despite comprising 31% of the town's population. More concerning were the irregularities in contract awards, Kim continued. 78% of landscaping contracts were awarded to companies owned by friends or relatives of committee members, often at rates 15–30% above market value. The room grew tense as Kim displayed a chart showing financial flows between committee funds and various businesses. Most troubling was the discovery of a shell company, Oakridge Heritage Landscaping, which received over $450,000 in contracts during the past decade despite having no employees and minimal equipment. This company's ownership traces back to a trust benefiting the family of former committee chairman Richard Whitman. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Dawn glanced toward Barbara Thornton, who sat rigid in her seat, her expression a mixture of shock and dismay. Dawn wondered how much the former council president had known about these financial machinations. Patricia Oakridge presented the final section, focusing on the broader impact of the committee's practices. Beyond the financial and discriminatory issues, we examined how committee decisions affected property values, community development, and civic engagement across Oakridge. Using mapping software, Oakridge demonstrated how neighborhoods receiving beautification projects had seen property values increase by an average of 12% more than other areas. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of advantage, she explained. Higher property values generated more tax revenue, which the committee then reinvested in the same neighborhoods while systematically neglecting others. As the panel concluded its presentation, Judge Martinez addressed the silent room. Based on our findings, we are making several recommendations to the town council. She outlined a comprehensive list of reforms, including transparent application processes, equitable distribution of beautification projects, and independent oversight of committee finances. Additionally, Martinez said, her tone grave, we have referred specific financial transactions to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation. The misappropriation of public funds through fraudulent contracting practices falls outside our purview as a review panel. James Lee thanked the panel and opened the floor for public comments. The line at the microphone quickly grew long as residents processed what they had heard. Marcus Torres spoke eloquently about the long-term economic impact of beautification inequities on property values in diverse neighborhoods. This wasn't just about flowers, he concluded. It was about who gets to build generational wealth in this town. Mabel Washington, supported by her grandson, approached the microphone slowly. I've lived in Westside for 80 years, she began. We always knew we weren't getting our fair share, but to see it laid out in dollars and cents, she shook her head. Now we need more than apologies, we need restoration. When Dawn's turn came, she spoke briefly but powerfully. These findings confirm what many of us experienced personally, but they also reveal a problem larger than any individual. Discriminatory systems persist because we allow them to operate unchallenged. Today marks an opportunity not just for accountability, but for genuine transformation of how Oakridge governs itself. As the meeting concluded, Dawn noticed Howard Mercer, the Tribune editor, deep in conversation with the panel members, while local television crews interviewed residents about their reactions. What had begun as a personal grievance had evolved into a watershed moment for the town. Outside the community center, Dawn found herself approached by a group of residents from Westside. Dr. Wilson, their spokesperson began, we're forming a community association to ensure the reforms are actually implemented. Would you consider serving as an advisor? Before Dawn could respond, Barbara Thornton approached, looking years older than she had just weeks before. Dr. Wilson, might I have a word? The Westside resident stepped aside respectfully as Barbara spoke in a low voice. I want you to know that I had no idea about the shell company or the extent of the financial improprieties, She struggled to maintain her composure. I trusted Richard, we all did, but that's no excuse for not asking more questions. Dawn studied the woman who had wielded so much power in Oakridge for decades. We all have blind spots, particularly when it comes to long-standing relationships. Barbara nodded. I've submitted my resignation from the council, effective immediately. It's the right thing to do, she hesitated. I also wanted to thank you. As difficult as this has been, Oakridge needed this reckoning. As Barbara walked away, Jade joined Dawn. That couldn't have been easy for her, Jade observed. No, Dawn agreed, but accountability rarely is. 3 days later, the district attorney announced a formal investigation into financial misconduct related to the Garden Committee. Richard Whitman, through his attorney, denied all allegations of wrongdoing while declining all interview requests. Meanwhile, the interim leadership of the Garden Committee, Sarah, Lisa, and George, worked diligently to implement the panel's recommendations. They established clear, objective criteria for membership applications and created a transparent project selection process that required equitable distribution of resources across all Oakridge neighborhoods. Dawn, in her role as special advisor, helped develop plans for a community garden in Westside and a botanical education program that would showcase diverse plant species and gardening traditions from around the world. We're thinking about renaming the annual garden festival, Lisa told Dawn during a planning meeting. Given its history, a fresh start seems appropriate. The Oakridge Diversity in Bloom Festival, Dawn suggested, celebrating the strength that comes from different roots growing together. The name was unanimously approved. As the criminal investigation proceeded, Dawn received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca Sanderson at the Chronicle. Dr. Wilson, I thought you should know. The publisher has asked me to lead a series examining other town institutions for similar patterns of exclusion. Your case has opened a door for investigations we couldn't pursue before. That's encouraging, Dawn replied. Sunlight makes the best disinfectant. And the best growing conditions, Rebecca added, having picked up some botanical metaphors during her coverage of the case. The following week brought another significant development. Dawn arrived home from a committee meeting to find a formal letter from the district attorney's office requesting her testimony before a grand jury considering charges against Richard Whitman and 2 former committee members. Amara, visiting for the weekend, found her mother in the garden contemplating the letter. Are you going to testify? She asked. Of course, Dawn replied. It's not a decision I take lightly, but truth requires courage. You've never lacked for that, Amara said proudly. The grand jury proceedings were closed to the public, but when Dawn emerged from the courthouse after giving her testimony, she found a small group waiting in support: Walter, Mabel, Marcus, Lisa, and others who had joined the movement for accountability. How did it go? Walter asked. I simply told the truth, Dawn replied. The evidence speaks for itself. 2 days later, news broke that the grand jury had returned indictments against Richard Whitman for fraud, misappropriation of public funds, and corruption. 2 other former committee members faced lesser charges related to the fraudulent contracting scheme. Dawn received the news with solemn reflection rather than triumph. Lives would be disrupted by these indictments, including those of innocent family members. Justice was necessary, but she took no joy in the pain it sometimes caused. That evening, as Dawn pruned her roses, a car pulled into her driveway. James Lee stepped out carrying a large envelope. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, he said, but I wanted to share something with you personally. Inside her kitchen, Lee spread out architectural drawings on the table. These are the plans for the new Oakridge Botanical Education Center. The council approved them unanimously this afternoon. Dawn studied the beautiful renderings of glass-walled conservatories, outdoor learning spaces, and gardens representing ecosystems from around the world. It will be built on the land where the old community swimming pool stood, Lee explained. Equal distance between downtown and Westside, accessible to everyone. Dawn traced the outlines of the education spaces with her finger. It's beautiful. We would like to name the research wing after you, Lee said. The Dr. Dawn Wilson Center for Botanical Diversity and Education. Dawn looked up, genuinely surprised. That's not necessary. It is, Lee insisted gently. Not just to honor your courage in challenging the status quo, but to recognize your lifetime of scientific contributions. The center will carry forward your work, teaching future generations about the importance of diversity in gardens and in communities. Later that night, Dawn sat in her garden as fireflies blinked in the summer darkness. The path from her initial committee rejection to this moment had been unpredictable and often difficult. What had begun as a personal stand against discrimination had uncovered layers of corruption, sparked a movement for equity, and would now result in an educational center that would serve generations to come. She thought of all the people who had found their voices during this process. Lisa Chen stepping into leadership, Mabel Washington speaking truth to power, Sarah Abernathy revealing financial irregularities despite personal risk. One person's courage had created space for others to stand up as well, creating a cascade of accountability and change. The criminal proceedings against Richard and his associates would continue for months. The work of reforming town institutions had only just begun. True equity would require vigilance and continued advocacy. But tonight, in her garden surrounded by plants that had defied expectations to thrive in Oakridge soil, Dawn felt the satisfaction of knowing that seeds of justice, once planted, could take root and grow in even the most resistant ground. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. For now, under a canopy of stars, she allowed herself to simply be present with the knowledge that one person's stand for dignity could, indeed, transform a community. The morning of the Oakridge Diversity in Bloom Festival dawned clear and bright, a perfect early autumn day with just a hint of crispness in the air. Dawn stood at her kitchen window, watching golden light spill across her garden as she sipped her morning tea. 1 year had passed since her rejection from the Garden Committee, a year that had transformed not only her life but the entire fabric of Oakridge. Today marked both a culmination and a new beginning. The festival, reimagined and restructured, would officially open the first phase of the Botanical Education Center. More importantly, it represented the community's first steps toward a more inclusive and equitable future. Dawn dressed carefully in a flowing tunic of vibrant African print fabric that Amara had given her for the occasion, accented by the pearls Marcus had given her decades ago. At 73, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had sustained her throughout the tumultuous events of the past year. Walter arrived to drive her to the festival grounds. "Ready for your big day?" he asked as she settled into the passenger seat. "It's not my day," Dawn corrected gently. "It belongs to everyone who worked to make these changes happen," Walter chuckled. "Always deflecting credit, some things never change." As they approached the festival site, Dawn was struck by the transformation. The formerly neglected land between downtown and Westside now featured meandering pathways, demonstration gardens, and the nearly completed main building of the Botanical Education Center. Banners in vibrant colors proclaimed "Diversity in Bloom," celebrating our community's roots. "Look at this turnout," Walter remarked as they searched for parking. People streamed toward the entrance from all directions, representing every neighborhood and demographic in Oakridge. Dawn noticed many familiar faces, but also many she didn't recognize, evidence of how the movement had grown beyond her initial circle of supporters. At the entrance, Lisa Chen waited to escort Dawn to the opening ceremony. "We've been looking for you," she said warmly. "The mayor's about to begin." Dawn raised an eyebrow. "Mayor Lee actually made it back from the conference in time," Lisa smiled. "He said wild horses couldn't keep him away. After all, this might be the most significant public event in Oakridge's recent history." They made their way through the festival grounds, where Dawn observed with approval how thoroughly the reimagined event reflected the community's diversity. Garden displays showcased traditions from around the world: Mexican marigold arrangements for Dia de los Muertos, Japanese moss gardens, native plant collections curated by members of the local indigenous community, and a vibrant display of African botanicals that Dawn had helped design. Equally significant was the distribution of vendors and performers throughout the grounds, with no priority locations that had previously been reserved for those with connections. Food stalls offered everything from traditional Southern barbecue to Korean bibimbap, West African jollof rice to Polish pierogi. "Dr. Wilson," voices called as Dawn passed. Children from the summer gardening program she had started waved excitedly, elderly residents from Westside nodded respectfully, and younger adults, many of whom had become active in community governance for the first time during the past year, offered words of gratitude. Near the central pavilion, Dawn spotted a face she hadn't expected to see. Barbara Thornton stood quietly at the edge of the gathering crowd, looking somewhat uncertain of her welcome. After her resignation from the council, Barbara had largely withdrawn from public life, focusing instead on community service through her church. Dawn deliberately made her way toward the former council president. "Barbara, I'm glad you came." Barbara seemed surprised by the warm greeting. "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted, "but this feels important to witness." "It is," Dawn agreed, And healing requires everyone's presence, especially those willing to acknowledge past mistakes and work toward something better. Barbara nodded, emotion briefly tightening her features. Thank you for that. Oakridge is still my home despite everything. I want to see it become the community it always should have been. As they spoke, they were joined by Mabel Washington, now using a wheelchair but still radiating determination. Well, isn't this something? Mabel remarked, looking around the festival. Never thought I'd live to see the day when Westside projects got equal funding with the rest of town. The housing rehabilitation grants were just the beginning, Barbara said, referring to the initiative that had emerged from the equity reforms. The infrastructure improvements are next. Dawn observed this exchange with quiet satisfaction. These women, once on opposite sides of Oakridge's invisible barriers, were now engaged in constructive dialogue about the community's future. The ceremony began with Mayor James Lee welcoming the gathered crowd. Today marks not just the opening of a festival or even a new educational center, he declared. It represents our community's commitment to growth, not just of plants, but of understanding, equity, and inclusion. Lee acknowledged the difficult journey that had led to this moment. Change rarely comes easily or without pain. The revelations of the past year forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about how our town has operated, but facing those truths has allowed us to begin building something better. Dawn listened from her seat in the front row, reflecting on the tangible changes that had occurred. Richard Whitman had pleaded guilty to reduced charges of misappropriation of public funds and was serving community service while making financial restitution. The Garden Committee now operated under transparent guidelines with diverse membership. Most significantly, a comprehensive equity audit had examined every town department and institution, resulting in reforms extending far beyond gardens to housing, education, and public services. Sarah Abernathy, now the permanent chair of the restructured Garden Committee, took the podium to outline the educational programs that would be offered at the new center. We're especially proud of our internship program for high school students, she announced. Participants will learn not just about plants, but about environmental justice, sustainable urban planning, and how green spaces can build community. As the ceremony continued, Dawn's thoughts drifted to the personal transformations she had witnessed. Lisa Chen had discovered her voice as an advocate and was now considering a run for town council. Marcus Torres had established a mentorship program connecting professional landscapers with youth from underserved neighborhoods. Even Rebecca Sanderson had found her purpose as a journalist, her investigative series on institutional equity earning regional recognition. Dawn was brought back to the present when Mayor Lee called her name. And now, it is my great privilege to invite Dr. Dawn Wilson to officially open the education center that bears her name. A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd as Dawn made her way to the podium. Looking out at the sea of faces, diverse in age, race, and background, yet united in purpose, she felt a profound sense of how far they had come. Thank you, Mayor Lee, and thank you all for being here today, she began. When I stood before the Garden Committee a year ago, I simply wanted to share my knowledge of botanical diversity. I never imagined where that moment would lead. Dawn paused, gathering her thoughts. In my research, I've studied how ecosystems thrive through diversity, how different species support and strengthen one another. The most resilient gardens are those with variety, where each plant contributes its unique qualities to the whole. She gestured to the community gathered before her. Communities are no different. We are strongest when every voice is heard, when every talent is recognized, when every contribution is valued. For too long, Oakridge flourished on the surface while neglecting the rich diversity that could have made it truly thrive. Dawn's voice strengthened. The changes we celebrate today aren't the end of our journey, but rather the beginning. True equity requires ongoing commitment and vigilance. There will be setbacks and resistance. But look around you, see what's possible when we work together across the artificial boundaries that once divided us. As she prepared to cut the ribbon stretched across the education center entrance, Dawn added, "My late husband Marcus used to say that gardens teach us patience, that meaningful growth can't be rushed. The same is true for communities. The seeds we plant today may not reach full bloom in our lifetimes, but we nurture them nonetheless, trusting that future generations will enjoy their beauty and sustenance." With those words, Dawn cut the ribbon, officially opening the Dr. Dawn Wilson Center for Botanical Diversity and Education. Applause rippled through the crowd as people began moving toward the entrance, eager to explore the new facility. Amara appeared at her mother's side, having flown in for the ceremony. Dad would have been so proud, she said, embracing Dawn. He is proud, Dawn replied softly. I feel him here today. As they toured the center together, Dawn appreciated how the designers had created spaces that honored multiple traditions and perspectives. The research library housed not only scientific texts but also volumes on indigenous plant knowledge, cultural gardening practices, and environmental justice. The central atrium featured a living wall of plants from 5 continents, demonstrating how species from different origins could thrive together in a shared environment. Most meaningful to Dawn was the community room, where photographs displayed the history of Oakridge's gardens, not just the manicured public spaces that had received attention for decades, but also the vibrant backyard gardens of Westside, the victory gardens of earlier generations, and the reclaimed vacant lots that community members had transformed into productive spaces. This is what I envisioned, Dawn murmured. Not erasing history, but completing it, telling the full story. Later that afternoon, as the festival continued around them, Dawn sat with her growing circle of friends in the shade of a young baobab tree, a cutting from her own garden that had been planted as one of the center's signature specimens. Walter and Mabel shared stories of the Oakridge they had known in their youth, while younger members of the group asked questions about the community's history and shared their hopes for its future. Dawn mostly listened, content to observe the intergenerational dialogue. Occasionally, she would correct a botanical detail or add historical context, but she understood that her role was increasingly that of mentor rather than leader. The movement she had helped catalyze now had its own momentum, carried forward by those who would shape Oakridge long after her time. As evening approached and lanterns illuminated the festival grounds, Jade joined their circle, bringing news from her latest civil rights case in a neighboring county. They're using the Oakridge reforms as a model, she reported. Your impact is spreading beyond this town. Dawn smiled but shook her head slightly. It's not my impact, it's the power of truth and persistence, and it belongs to all of us. When the celebration finally wound down, Amara drove her mother home through streets now peaceful in the gathering darkness. Are you tired? She asked, noticing Dawn's quietness. Satisfied, Dawn corrected. There's a difference. At home, despite the late hour, Dawn found herself drawn to her garden. Under the silver light of a nearly full moon, she walked among her plants, touching leaves and blooms that gleamed like ghostly sentinels in the darkness. She stopped beside her baobab, now several feet tall and thriving. The cutting at the education center would eventually grow into a massive tree that would stand for centuries, long after she was gone, long after the current conflicts and resolutions of Oakridge had faded into history. Yet the tree would carry her influence forward in ways she couldn't fully imagine. Visitors to the center would rest in its shade, children would learn about its African origins, scientists might study its adaptation to changing climate conditions. Its presence would silently testify to the possibility of transplanting and thriving in new environments, botanical and human alike. Dawn sat on the bench beside the tree, feeling the weight of the day's emotions. There was pride in what had been accomplished, certainly, but also humility before the work that remained, and gratitude for the coalition of diverse voices that had emerged to carry that work forward. In the quiet darkness of her garden, Dawn reflected on the journey of the past year. What had begun as a personal stand against discrimination had evolved into a community-wide reckoning with systemic inequity. The Garden Committee, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a vehicle for transformation, not just of itself but of the broader community it served. Dawn had never sought to become an activist in her 70s. After a lifetime of breaking barriers in academia, she had hoped for a peaceful retirement tending her beloved plants. Yet when confronted with injustice, she had drawn on the same persistence that had characterized her scientific work: the meticulous gathering of evidence, the strategic building of alliances, the unwavering commitment to truth. As she finally rose to go inside, Dawn felt at peace. The garden of justice she had helped plant in Oakridge would continue to grow, tended by many hands. There would be seasons of flourishing and seasons of challenge, as in any garden. But the roots were strong now, extending deep into the community's consciousness. Tomorrow would bring new work, curriculum development for the education center, mentoring the high school interns, continuing to advocate for equitable distribution of resources throughout Oakridge. The journey toward true justice was ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and renewal. But tonight, in the quiet satisfaction of seeds well planted and beginning to bloom, Dawn Wilson allowed herself to simply be, a gardener who had helped transform not just the physical landscape of her town, but its moral terrain as well. Inside her home, she placed the festival program on her desk beside a framed photograph of Marcus. "We did good work today, love," she whispered to his image. Then she turned off the light and headed to bed, ready for whatever tomorrow's garden might require.